Well, it is the world's biggest security alliance, now scrambling to prove it still works. NATO members are set to approve a spending hike to 5% of GDP, aiming to revitalize the bloc that U.S. President Donald Trump once called obsolete. Now, Trump is attending the NATO summit in The Hague, ready to bask in the praise that's being heaped on him for pressuring EU states to boost their defense spending. He's repeatedly called on the EU to take more responsibility for its own security. And while the new 5% spending pledge is the summit's key headline, the wording of NATO's final declaration is still being worked on. Spain has already negotiated an exemption from the spending hike, and other member states are now also looking for carve-outs too. And here's the European Union's foreign policy chief, Kaja Kallas, speaking at that summit.
Well, this summit is about one thing and one thing only. This is 5% and more defense investments. And allies seem to be united. I think the understanding is everybody needs to do more for defense because we are living in very turbulent times. And that is the agreement where the allies are united.
I'd like to welcome Rose Gottemoeller, former Deputy Secretary General of NATO and lecturer for international security and cooperation at Stanford University, joining us today from New York City. So NATO set to adopt this 5% spending pledge. First of all, what is your most important takeaway from that?
The most important takeaway, well, there are actually two. One is that NATO got the message. It began to happen during Trump's first term in office from 2017 through 2021. But they got the message that they cannot free ride on the United States anymore. They need to be developing their own defense capability and capacity. They need to be spending the money to build their own weapon systems and their own capabilities. So that's very important, that indicator. The other important thing I think about this 5% of GDP, though, is that it incorporates a degree of flexibility that will be helpful to all the NATO allies. For example, the fact that now infrastructure such as roads, rail, bridges, etc., can now be considered part of defense expenditure as long as they are reinforced and capable of supporting military traffic in the terrible event that we need to reinforce our troops with a Russian attack underway. But that kind of flexibility is very important. I think it gives the NATO allies a good deal of opportunity to play with the numbers, but in a positive way. I want to stress, not to undermine the numbers, but to really play with them in order to develop and strengthen defense capacity across NATO Europe.
So how difficult will it be for allies to actually meet this goal? Many have said Trump is on a victory lap here because, like you said, they've got the message finally. But currently, are NATO members only agreeing to make this summit seem successful while he's in town to gloss over what's to come down the road?
There will be very, very serious heavy lifting that has to be done across NATO to reach the 3.5% of GDP. That is the requirement for real military capabilities, for weapon systems and for other equipment and materiel that adds up to real military capabilities in addition to the infrastructure work that I was talking about earlier. So that's going to be a huge heavy lift for the NATO allies, and some are quite hesitant that they'll be able to accomplish it over the next 10 years. So I think that it's important that the momentum is launched. As I mentioned, all of the NATO allies, except one, as I understand, will be at 2% of GDP in the coming year, which was the earlier goal. And so now they will be, I think, setting out on this new quest, and it will be a difficult one. But nevertheless, I do think that NATO allies, and it's not because of Donald Trump and his threats, it's because of the threats that they have seen with Russia invading Ukraine over the last 3 years and this terrible war of aggression that's been going on. They know they have a problem to confront in a newly aggressive Russia.
And yet it seems that this year, Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine is not as high on the agenda at this summit as it has been in years past. When you look broadly, what has been the biggest problem for NATO in responding to Russia's invasion?
over time, and we are looking back at the Biden administration here for really the bulk of the period we're talking about, but over time, there was a good deal of difficulty in NATO coming to agreement about what was required to support Ukraine, with different countries placing emphasis on different weapon systems over time. I think the quintessential debate was over long-range missile systems that would be capable of attacking territory and targets inside the Russian Federation. And so these kinds of big debates extended over a period of time and led to uncertainty for Ukraine about what kind of capacity they would have available from their erstwhile partners, from the NATO allies. I think where NATO succeeded best over the past 3-4 years has been in really improving the delivery to Ukraine of standard equipment like ammunition. And the kinds of things that NATO can provide on a day in, day out basis has been very beneficial to Ukraine. But it's been a hard road, I think, overall, because of the differences in NATO countries and how fast they've been able to reach these decisions.
And with this 5% defense spending pledge, do you see this as really setting things in motion and building some kind of momentum that will ultimately help Ukraine?
Yes, we're in a different place nowadays. For example, with NATO defense industries, with the defense industries now ramping up, they are retooling, they are modernizing their ability to produce military goods and weapons and equipment. And I think that this puts us in a different place than where we were even a few short years ago. And I think we also see Ukraine being a leader here in terms of the modern capabilities. The drone systems are the biggest example here, the modern capabilities with new technologies incorporated into them, and giving the opportunity for tech companies to really begin to deliver defense equipment and capabilities and to ramp up. So in a way, Ukraine is modeling this for the NATO allies as well. And I think that there can be a very beneficial partnership there going forward. So yes, I think the momentum can be sustained and will build over time as these expenditures get underway.
And with this momentum building, I'm curious where you see Germany fitting into this picture. We've had Chancellor Merz pledging to make the Bundeswehr the strongest conventional army in Europe. What will that mean for Berlin?
It will also require a lot of heavy lifting, I think, over time, not only to build up the weapons and equipment, but also in terms of the manpower shortages and what Germany will have to do to ensure that recruitment is at the proper level to sustain an army of that strength. So these are all important problems and issues for Germany to confront. But I will point out that Germany has an established military manufacturing capability. Rheinmetall is, of course, one of the biggest military defense companies in Europe. And so I do think that Germany has a lot to work with. And once again, I want to point at the opportunities here for the tech sectors, for smaller companies, for small and medium enterprises with a foot in the door on technology development to play a real role. And I think here too, German, how shall I put it? German Silicon Valley companies can really benefit from what is going on in the defense sector.
Yeah. So with what appears to be a really positive vision of the future of NATO here, do you see some kind of irony that it's perhaps Donald Trump, who's been a great NATO skeptic, who might be the one who's secured the future of the alliance for decades to come?
Well, it does make me smile a bit because I remember the first visits of President Trump in 2017 and 18 to NATO, and what a huge shock to the NATO system those visits were because of the way that he was so unrelenting in his attacks on free riders, freeloaders in NATO, as he called them. So he did start this change, this sea change. He started it going, but I want to stress once again that it is a threat from a newly aggressive Russia that has really driven the pace now and really brought the NATO allies around to really recognizing that they cannot do it without building up and modernizing their capability and ensuring that their defense industries are up to the job as well.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. We've been speaking with former Deputy NATO Secretary General Rose Gottemoeller.
You're welcome.
Now, on his Truth Social platform, President Trump has posted a message that he received from the NATO Secretary General. Mark Rutte praised Trump for pushing allies to agree to the 5% defense spending target. And Rutte was then asked whether he'd been maybe trying a bit too hard to please Trump here.
But look what is inside my text message to him. When it comes to the 2%, delivering the 2%, without him, it would never have happened this year, let's be honest. Beginning of this year, 7 countries were saying, well, maybe somewhere in 2031, 2032. All these 7, 8 countries are now 2%. And when it comes to the 5%, we have to do this because of the capability targets. We have to keep ourselves safe from the Russians. But the good news is that it's also equalizing what we are spending here in Europe and Canada with what the US is spending.
Was Mark Rutte speaking there, and who better to break this all down for us than our correspondent, Teri Schultz, who joins us now from The Hague. So it does seem that the NATO Secretary General and the Netherlands, as the host country here, are doing what they can to please U.S. President Trump. Could you just give us an update on how the evening's going?
That's right. After a lavish dinner hosted by the king, President Trump is actually sleeping in the Royal Palace. He's certainly the only one of the 32 NATO leaders to be doing that. So really rolling out not just the red carpet, literally, but also figuratively, to make sure that Donald Trump has a good experience at the NATO summit. But I can tell you that it's not just this very flowery and flattering letter from Mark Rutte, saying that Donald Trump should take this as a personal win. This has actually been a plan of all of the allies for quite some time. Speaking with diplomats off the record months ago, we learned that it was offered to Trump that if he came and he stayed committed to NATO, that they would chalk this 5% pledge up to Trump personally. So that's what was certainly encapsulated in these messages that Mark Rutte sent to Trump. I don't think that he expected them to become public because they were so overly gratuitous toward Trump. He also mentioned Iran, and that's not something that he would be speaking about as NATO Secretary General, thanking Trump for his strikes on Iran. So, yeah, a bit of an awkward situation there for the Secretary General, but it seems to be all ending up fine as long as Trump is here and happy.
Yeah, probably not something he expected to go public. Let's talk about the 5% defense spending. Yep. That is a major increase for most of these countries. How difficult has it been to get member states to agree to this?
That's right. It's well over double what a lot of countries are spending currently. And there's a lot of suspicion and worry that many of those countries who will be approving this 5% pledge tomorrow are only doing it on paper, that they just want this, again, to be considered a successful summit, keep the U.S. happy because this was a demand of Donald Trump. But then after the summit, when you go back and actually have to work out where are we getting this money, what are we going to spend it on, how long do we have to do it, the date is going to be 2035, there are going to be a lot of problems in actually keeping this promise. And some leaders even will say privately that, that's so far down the road, we'll figure it out later. Let's just get past this summit and have it be a success. You know that Spain said openly it wasn't going to get to 5%. It was the first country to say so. Now Slovakia and the Belgian opposition are also saying if they don't have to spend it, we don't want to spend it.
Mm-hmm. Now, one would also think that the war in Ukraine would be front and center at the summit, but it doesn't seem that that is actually the case this year. Can you tell us why that is?
That's true. If you look back at the last 2 summits before this, in Washington and Vilnius, certainly aid for Ukraine and President Zelensky himself were absolutely at the center of not just the ceremonial part, but also the business side of NATO. Now, at this summit, it was well known that Donald Trump did not want Ukraine and aid to Ukraine specifically to be a major part of the summit. The U.S. delegation even argued to keep any mention of Ukraine out of the final summit document tomorrow. That isn't exactly going to be the case, but there's not going to be any talk, for example, about Ukraine's eventual membership in NATO, as there was last year in Washington. At the same time, the last word I have, Clara, is that President Zelensky and President Trump will have a meeting tomorrow, Wednesday, short as it may be. It wasn't sure whether that would happen at all. President Zelensky will be meeting with other European leaders who very much want to show that their support for him is not flagging in any way, regardless of what the U.S. does. But we'll just have to see how things work out tomorrow. One thing that organizers, the Dutch, are very worried about is that you have to avoid another Oval Office-like spectacle between Presidents Trump and Zelensky. So they would have preferred there's no meeting at all rather than risk that. We'll just have to see what happens tomorrow.
Teri, thank you so much for bringing us that news. That's our correspondent, Teri Schultz, in The Hague. U.S. President Donald Trump is preparing to join NATO leaders at a summit in The Hague. Air Force One touched down in the Netherlands a short while ago. Top of the agenda at the summit will be increases in national defense spending. Allies are expected to commit to a target of 5% of their country's GDP by the year 2035. The move reflects U.S. pressure on NATO members to take more responsibility for their own security and deepening concern about the threat from Russia. DW's Brussels Bureau Chief Alexandra von Namen has been speaking to leaders arriving at those talks in the Netherlands.
We are here in The Hague at the NATO summit, now joined by Kaja Kallas, the EU Foreign Policy Chief. Thank you for being with us, High Representative. So this summit is expected to be short and crisp and to focus on one big issue, a massive increase in defense spending. And it seems like it is all about pleasing Donald Trump, is it?
Well, we really need to invest in defense. I mean, the goal is very ambitious, and it's true that President Trump has been talking about this for quite some time. So many didn't just listen, but now we are in the security situation that we are, and most of the European countries have realized that we actually need to do this. Yes, true, we have peacetime, but the trouble with defense spending is that you need to spend it while you have peace. So in order to deter any aggressors in the world to make any steps towards us.
So spending a lot of money on defense is one thing, and buying and producing new weapons is the other thing. It's not going to happen overnight. What is the EU doing to help European allies to achieve that goal, to ramp up their production of weapons?
Well, we have done many things. I mean, first we have made financial resources available, and also, changed the rules so that member states can use this leverage of funding to put more money into defense. Second, we are also working on, procurement rules and all the rules to make them more simple, so that we can bring the costs down, but we can also shorten the procurement times. And third, we are also cooperating with the Ukraine defense industry, because they have actually created the defense industry from scratch, being very creative there, very innovative, and there's a lot we can learn from there. It's also about cost effectiveness, and that is what we are doing together.
And we expect this summit to end with the final document that all NATO members are expected to agree on. But we are hearing there will be only one sentence or two as a reference to Russia and only as a threat, not as an aggressor. Would you be disappointed if that happens?
It is, of course, every summit is different, and every summit's focus is different. This time it's the 5% and how to really, spend more and invest more in defense. I think also for Ukraine, it's a clear message that member states can actually also, help Ukraine more if they invest into defense more. So I think the outcome is important, that it's only not the decisions, but it's actually made in practice, the execution of these decisions.
And at previous summits in Vilnius and Washington, we saw allies lock arms with Ukraine, and President Zelensky played a more prominent role. There, it seems to be different. Here, why is it so? And what does it mean for NATO's support for Ukraine?
Well, I guess why is it so. It is...
Why?
It is because times have changed, but for Europe, Ukraine is our top priority, and that's why we are committing to helping Ukraine. We are committed to putting more pressure on Russia so that they would also want peace. I mean, 100 days ago, Ukraine agreed to unconditional ceasefire. We are still waiting that Russia does the same. So the only way to do it is to help Ukraine to defend themselves and also put pressure on Russia. So Europe is definitely very strong in its messages. We also have the European summit coming up this week. So there, I think, we should move with the enlargement track, because that is the hope for the Ukrainian people. We need to show that Europe is their family.
Are you confident that the summit will send the message that it is expected to send a message of unity, that Europe and the US are standing together and determined to continue supporting Ukraine? Or is this summit at risk that President Donald Trump could derail it in the end?
Well, this summit is about one thing and one thing only. This is 5% and more defense investments. And their, allies seem to be united. I think the understanding is everybody needs to do more for defense, because we are living in very turbulent times. And that is the agreement where the allies are united.
So let's get across to Ukraine and our correspondent, Nick Connolly there. Nick, we just heard Kaja Kallas, who, by the way, has been one of Ukraine's staunchest supporters in Europe, seemingly trying to avoid DW's question about what appears to be a move toward NATO softening its stance toward Russia. How alarming is that in Kiev?
Well, certainly it's not something that goes unnoticed. The fact that Ukraine is now a kind of side note to a bigger event. We had Kaja Kallas there saying that this summit was all about the 5% and that is the only focus. And we've heard about worries here in Ukraine that Zelensky will only get to see Trump briefly, that he won't be at the most important events, which is certainly a contrast to the way it would have been a couple of years ago under Biden, where countering Russia's aggression here in Ukraine was the central theme. I think they understand why. They understand that Kaja Kallas, as an Estonian former leader, is desperate to keep the Americans in NATO, keep Donald Trump, who is, and Donald Trump and his administration have been so clear about NATO membership not being on the table for Ukraine. They don't want to provoke him. They want to keep him on side. I think this is part of a bigger effort by Europeans to basically give Trump what he wants rhetorically, praise him, give him all the credit for potentially ending a war between Iran and Israel, all the kind of things he wants to hear, and then hope that in the actual nitty-gritty he sticks to Ukraine or Europe in the wider sense, and at least allows Ukraine to buy weapons. Right now, no one here expects new packages of aid as were received under Biden, but they do hope that they'll keep on getting intelligence from the US and that they will be able to buy spare parts for the Patriot air defense systems, other kind of vital systems that can't be replaced by the Europeans.
Yeah, and amid that backdrop, do you get a sense of how NATO leaders are thinking these days about the threat coming from Russia?
Well, certainly seen here from Ukraine, it's all too little, too late and too slow. I think you really see also a dichotomy between northern and kind of Eastern European leaders on the one hand, who are a lot more attuned to what's going on here in Ukraine, are a lot more clued in and are a lot more present in terms of visiting Ukraine, and then leaders in places like Spain who have a real hard time explaining to their publics why they should spend more money on defence, why they should divert money from social spending to defence. And we really see the kind of huge kind of variance you've got there from countries like Poland that spend a lot on defence to countries like Portugal and Spain at the bottom end of that kind of scale. We've had the head of Germany's army, the Bundeswehr, saying that Russia, he thinks, will be ready for a large-scale European war beyond Ukraine in 2029, and has basically said that Germany needs to prepare for that. So that is something that is seen as very welcome. But even 5% now, that ranking, kind of cranking up of spending, is still pretty low compared to what Ukraine is having to do. Ukraine is spending over a quarter of GDP on defence, so that is still a multitude of times bigger as a percentage of what Ukraine produces economically than even the most kind of optimistic European countries.
Yeah, that really does put it into perspective. And when you look at this new boost in defense spending, any idea how much of it could actually end up going toward helping Ukraine?
Well, I think it's about just increasing the kind of defence base, right? We've seen Europe having lots of different systems, lots of different inventions, but very, very small capacity to actually produce any of it on a large scale. So any of that being increased and these manufacturers getting long-term contracts and the ability to expand their production with some kind of financial certainty is welcome. And also Ukraine is obviously dependent on lots of these countries just handing over things from their stocks directly to Ukraine, open market purchases as a foreign country are always going to take a lot longer. Things like air defense systems that Europe produce, like IRIS-T, if you don't have that kind of special privilege to get kind of the top of the queue, you're going to be waiting for 5 or 10 years to get it. I think people here in Ukraine are acutely aware, especially of the air defense problem and the lack of missiles for those systems. We've had people today again being killed by ballistic missile attacks. So that really is a priority and something the Ukrainians are trying to kind of ram home as a priority to get kind of happening faster.
Nick, thank you, as always. That is Nick Connolly in Kiev.